Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Welcome to a session, an analytical session, regarding the topic of anarchism with a special focus on the United States and social justice. On January 20th, 2025, when Donald Trump was inaugurated, surrounded by billionaires, mostly from Silicon Valley, high-tech billionaires, he announced that the United States was about to enter a golden age. 6 months later, what we have is a society, both at home and abroad, confronting conditions which would hardly qualify as a golden age, given the extreme polarization in American society, and given the continuation of the two major wars. There are many wars, by the way. It's true, between 100 and 125 wars around the world, smaller ones than the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and the one that Israel has launched against the Palestinian people and, of course, its neighbors since October 2023. What we have in the case of the United States is a country that hardly inspires stability, not only because it has failed, as the Trump administration promised, to bring an end to war. And in fact, this was one of the topics that the administration stressed when coming to office, and even during the campaign, that he was not a forever war doctrine president like the Cold War Democrats of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. That he would, in fact, he was a unilateralist, not a multilateralist. He was a person who disliked U.S. engagement in conflicts that would not be in the interest of the United States. However, here we are. Reality is facing the country in the face. Here we are in June 2025, mid-June, and there is a major outbreak between Israel and Iran, behind which, of course, the U.S. admitted, is the United States in full complicity. Things did not work out with the nuclear arms negotiations between Iran and the United States, and the U.S. thought it would try a different route, namely the route of Israel's determination to launch a war against Iran, as though Iran is Lebanon or Syria, when in fact Iran is a major player in the Middle East, determining part of the regional balance of power along with Israel. And behind Iran is Russia and China, as they clearly stated in the UN Security Council. At the same time that all of this is happening, there is the background domestically of the United States government sending the National Guard and Marines to Los Angeles County to crack down on migrants, which, of course, a number of officials and right-wing press have argued, along with their protesters, are made up of anarchists. A word deliberately used to demonize and to castigate the protesters against unusual force, as the Governor Newsom of California pointed out, when he never invited federal troops, he never invited the intervention of the U.S. Department of Defense in Los Angeles County to deal with the issue of migrants. And at the same time that all of this is happening, we had the very ugly incident of the junior senator of California, Alex Padilla, obviously a Hispanic of Hispanic descent, rather, who had been arrested, briefly detained, very briefly, thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and at the same time, a couple of days later, on June 14, 2025, we have the political assassination of two state officials in Minnesota, both Democrats. The woman was gunned down. Melissa Hortman is her name. She and her husband were gunned down by a right-wing fanatic dressed as a police officer. And she was a representative, a Democrat, and Senator John Hoffman. He and his wife were injured by the same gunman. This incident, along with the background of militarism abroad and police state methods at home, and use of political assassinations to resolve political conflict, albeit by someone who's not probably, but more than likely, in serious need of psychiatric treatment. But the issue here is that when political differences are resolved through such measures of up to political assassination or heavy-handed tactics such as the senator from California Alex Padilla experienced in Los Angeles, this is indicative of an authoritarian society. This is not how an open society treats its own political opposition. This is only found in authoritarian societies, not in open, democratic, liberal democracies. Now, the interesting thing here is just recently, the government of Canada, right next door to the United States, okay, a historically friendly country to the United States, warned its own citizens not to travel to the United States. This is Canada. This is not Venezuela or Cuba or Iran. This is Canada, warning its citizens not to go to the US. This was not the first time. This is a warning on top of previous warnings. And tourism in the United States, is a number of US Democratic senators and congressmen have stated, and especially governors, Democratic governors, including the governor of New York, by the way, have pointed out tourism, incoming tourism to the United States has been down severely. The statistics vary. From Canada alone, it's 40% down. And the issue is, are people, just ordinary people, let's put aside politics, are ordinary people from around the world not going to the United States because their government said so, because they're afraid of anarchists? By the way, the word is classical Greek, which means without authority, defiance of authority, because presumably authority is repressive and tyrannical. That's what the word means. Anarchist, defiance of authority, because the assumption is the authority is tyrannical toward the subjects, toward its citizens. Are people afraid of anarchists out in the streets? Does the US have that many anarchists, considering that the Pew Research Center doesn't have much by way of statistics regarding the number of anarchists in America? Or is it that Canadian citizens, as much as the rest of the world, Europeans included, by the way, are not traveling to the United States, And one of the reasons that the airlines, despite the rise in airline fuel because of wars, especially in the Middle East, despite the rise of airline fuel, have brought down their prices because they're looking ahead and they're seeing problems of people coming into the United States, tourism in the US. Are they afraid of anarchists or are they afraid of US government policies? And the answer here is very clear given the record of how the rest of the world, according to public opinion polls, is perceiving the US right now as a government that is not welcoming foreigners. It's not only that it has placed all sorts of sanctions and limitations on many countries from the global south, especially sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and some Asian countries. It's not just that. It is the reality that the bourgeoisie, who have the middle class, which has the money to travel and the luxury to travel, the time to travel, is not deciding to spend its money traveling to the United States because of fear. From the time they arrive at the airport, given the history of the last 6 months, okay, and what happens at customs, to safety inside the United States. And this is what the government of Canada is warning about as well. So the golden age of 6 months ago promised is not has not materialized, not because the United States has some massive anarchist movement as though we're 19th century Russia or late 19th century Italy or France. Or Spain. They had substantial, not massive, but substantial anarchist movements. Or even the United States in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the United States, before Woodrow Wilson crushed the anarchists, by the way, the U.S. had an anarchist movement linked to the trade union movement and believe it or not, to the feminist movement, the early days of feminism in America. That's not the reason. The reason is because ordinary people from around the world, including next door, Canadians, are afraid of the US government and what it would do to them once they enter. So this is an issue. This is a major issue. And it goes to the heart of what kind of society is it that resolves conflict. Obviously, what happened in Minnesota, I agree. There has to be an investigation. They have to find out, and more than likely, the gunman had. Obviously, an ordinary human being doesn't pick up a gun and go shoot people because they're of the political opposition. You have to obviously be in need of psychiatric treatment to be doing that. The fact is, however, there is a larger political climate, and of all publications, the National Catholic Reporter, hardly an anti-US publication, recently ran an article entitled "Trump Administration Plows On Ahead, Releasing Anarchy." Not the people of the United States, but the Trump administration releasing anarchy upon the world. And the theme here, within the country and upon the world, and the theme here of this publication, again, National Catholic Reporter, is that the United States has embarked on a course of bypassing, ignoring, transcending the law, and the courts, whether domestically or globally, whether it's the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court making decisions about, for example, the genocide in Israel and the crimes there, the war crimes, which even, by the way, former Israeli officials admit have taken place, and they ongoing. This is still taking place right now. all the way to what is happening inside the country with regard to the procedures and the legal perimeters which are supposed to be followed by the government. When the government does not follow legal perimeters, it doesn't follow the Constitution. When the government is above the law, according to the father of Western liberalism, the 17th century philosopher John Locke, who wrote in two treatises of government in 1688, 1689, during the Glorious Revolution, John Locke, the father of Western liberalism, argued that when the head of state, at that time it was monarchy, of course, when the king, when the head of state in our time, the president or prime minister, is above the law, that constitutes tyranny. When the social contract is violated, when the social contract itself is violated by none other than the head of state, that is grounds for tyranny. That constitutes tyranny, and people don't know where they stand, because what we have here is, if we look at it from a political philosophical perspective, is arbitrary government. Nobody knows. What is it going to be? Me? Is it going to be that person? Is going? Nobody knows who's next. Where are the boundaries? So this is the reason for law. This is the reason for a legal structure. This is a reason for a constitution to operate within constitutional boundaries and within the orders of the courts when they are issued, rather than ignoring them. Now, I want to give you an overview of anarchism from a historical perspective. I believe that the first anarchists were Adam and Eve. They defied the ultimate authority, their own creator, God, according to the Bible, to the Christian Bible, the Judeo-Christian Bible. They defied their own authority. They were anarchists. Anarchism means defiance of authority. And they went their own way. They asserted their will over the will of their creator. Therein rests what constitutes sin. The ultimate sin is defiance of the will of the creator, according to this interpretation, to the interpretation of the Bible as the Christians see it. Now, many argue that Jesus Christ was also an anarchist. He defied not just Hebrew authority, he defied Roman authority at the time of the birth of the Roman Empire. So what we have is a long-standing tradition, even within the religious realm. And this continues, of course, with Martin Luther, who was a religious reformer, a religious who defied the ultimate authority, Western Christendom. And it continues with anarchists politicized after the Industrial Revolution, because anarchism as a movement and a philosophical ideology really solidifies during industrial capitalism in the 19th century. It is in the 19th century that anarchism takes root in Europe, from Russia to Italy to Spain, France. It really takes root there, and it's always linked to the trade union movement, the unionization of workers, as the division of labor begins to change because of industrial capitalism, right? It takes root there, and after especially after the U.S. Civil War, after 1865, we have anarchists and syndicalists in the United States, and the spreading of anarchists and syndicalists from Mexico down to South America. So there is anarchism as a movement. Now, what did the anarchists, the classical anarchists, preach, from Russian to French to Italian? They believed that the ultimate machine of exploitation and repression was the state acting on behalf of the elites in a hierarchical society, which they opposed because they advocated they advocated no hierarchy and egalitarian society, and they were resolved to hold government, the ultimate authority, the state, responsible, accountable, and to explain why it deserved the consent of the governed. Okay, this is a philosophical question. The consent of the governed in the social contract to give it legitimacy. What constitutes legitimacy in a liberal democracy other than the consent of the governed to the sovereign state? The, the question is, do they deserve it? If they deviate, as the father of Western liberalism pointed out, John Locke, from the social contract, if they go above the law and serve their personal interest, the interests of a few around them, the interests of an elite class, okay, if they do that to the detriment of society as a whole, to the detriment of the welfare of society, to the rest of the population, that constitutes tyranny. So, in other words, anarchism, it is not surprising, was a reaction during the age of industrial capitalism, especially, like I said, in the late 19th century, and eventually, by the way, spread to the rest of Asia as well. Japan, for example. Anarchism, it remains a reaction to state-sponsored repression, and the state used as a vehicle of exploitation and repression to induce conformity to the status quo, because people are questioning the legitimacy of the establishment, the institutional establishment. So this is very important. Now here we have a situation, very specific situation, that involves the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE. The acronym ICE. We'll use that, the acronym, in Los Angeles County, where a number of right-wing media elements, a number of politicians, and even Democrats, some Democrats, and even the sheriff of LA County argued that, well, we're not so sure that these protesters supporting the migrants and these migrants themselves are really genuinely interested in social justice, which is the ultimate, according to the anarchists themselves. That is their ultimate goal: social justice and peace, not the classical aberrations of anarchism, which are, and these are, because there are many varieties of anarchism, by the way, and you have to really, one has to read a number of books on anarchism from the 19th century to the present to see that there are many varieties of anarchism. Yes, there were anarchists who engaged in political assassination, targeted political assassinations of police chiefs, for example, there's out of Russia. They engaged in political assassinations as a means to resolve issues, to bring attention to a social justice problem. Many on the left, including Marxists, sharply disagreed. One of the reasons that Marx and Engels did not want to associate with anarchists was precisely because of that. They did not agree with such tactics. They didn't think that would solve anything. That was basically a lot of drama that, yes, it brought a lot of attention to the issue, but it did not address the systemic problems of society and a constructive resolution to the problem. Now, here we are in Los Angeles County, and the question is, why did the Trump administration send National Guard without the invitation of the Governor Newsom, or the mayor of Los Angeles, without the local authorities, without anyone in law enforcement locally saying, please send us the Marines, send us the National Guard. We want federal intervention in a local issue. And the question, of course, the larger question, when we look at at this issue from an analytical statistical perspective, the larger question is, why not Texas? Texas has about the same percentage of Hispanics, about the same percentage of illegals as California. Why not Texas? California has been historically a target of the GOP, especially the far right wing of the GOP. Even before Trump, this is not about Trump, by the way. This is not about Trump. This is about the far right wing within the GOP, which is now the majority, targeting the bluest of the blue states, as it's called in the US. In other words, the hardcore Democratic state, California, the liberal state, the largest state, the most prosperous state, which sends, by the way, close to $1 trillion, just under $1 trillion, to the federal government. But Trump wanted to deprive the state of California of $80 billion that the federal government sends. Think about that. The federal government sends about 10% of what it receives from the state of California. And of course, the governor of California mentioned that. This is indicative of targeting this state because it's a blue state. And like I said, why not Texas? Because it has a Republican legislature, a Republican governor, and they are pro-Trump, and they are more than willing to bring in to invite the Department of Defense, to bring in the National Guard, to crack some heads, migrants. Now, the question, of course, is if we deconstruct the so-called migrant issue in California, what we find is that the migrants first of all, the Hispanic population, California, by the way, was acquired by the United States. The entire Southwest and much of the West was acquired by the United States during the presidency of James Polk. The Polk administration during the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846-1848, and the U.S. basically provided a formal token payment of $15 million for acquiring all that land, and then they took it back because the U.S. had extended loans to Mexico, so they just took the land. California historically has been a state with a large presence from not just Mexico, but Latin America, Mesoamerica, that is Central America as well. There is indeed a very large population, 17 million Hispanics. There is also a large population that is illegal. However, 40% of the illegals in California have been in the United States at least 10 years. Here's the issue. Are these people anarchists, or are they just workers? To its credit, the Wall Street Journal, of all publications, the Wall Street Journal published a story that inside the White House there was frustration, that the Trump administration had promised mass deportations for the sake of drama, by the way, in theater, because there is a process and always to be followed within legal perimeters, mass deportations for the sake of appealing to the far right-wing populist base of the party, such as it is, mostly made up of the middle class with some working class elements, that doesn't solve the problem constructively. Now, when they were frustrated, they were not doing enough of mass deportations. Why? Because they actually set a trap for themselves, telling the American people, that, you know what the problem is with these illegals? They're drug dealers, they're criminals, they're gang members. By the way, a number of them are. Just like if you study the history of immigrants in America from the 19th century to the present, what you find is within all immigrant communities, okay, you will have elements that are predisposed to crime, just as you have native elements predisposed to crime. The Irish mob, the Italian mob, the Jewish mob. So you have this history, it's part of the American historical record. So it's not that difficult to figure out, especially when you pay workers 44 cents on the dollar versus the the legal residents. You're going to have a problem. You're going to have crime. I mean, they have higher unemployment. They have obviously the uncertainty of being caught by ICE, the immigration service. They have a higher sense of uncertainty in how they live. Yes, they are going to be involved in crime, just like um, people who were born in the United States, who are poor. Because when you look at the prison population, criminologists point out that when you look at the American criminal statistics, the crime statistics in the United States, and when you look at the prison population, what you find statistically is that the prison population is made up of minorities and the poor. Who else is going to commit? Why would you commit a crime? You are going to commit a crime, but it's going to be blue collar crime. If you're a bank president, you're probably never going to go to prison, and if you are, it's going to be one of these Hilton prisons, one of these white collar prisons rather. Why historically this is what the father of modern criminology, Cesare Beccaria, the Italian Enlightenment thinker, argued that this is where crime is committed. Why would the rich commit crimes? The rich. That's very rare. It's only when they have mental problems, they have psychological problems, and when greed drives them to violate the law and accumulate more money so they commit a crime there, white collar crime. Okay? So obviously it stands to reason. Why would anybody be surprised? But here's the thing, the vast majority, according to the Wall Street Journal, had nothing to do with crime. And inside the White House, what this publication discovered is that there was frustration. Why aren't we arresting more of these people? And there was an order given by one of the advisors to Donald Trump, at least 3,000 a day, 3,000 a day, 90,000 a month, and deport. That's part of mass deportation. So there was a quota on how many should be arrested. And the question was then, again, according to the publication, where are we going to find them? And the answer was go to Home Depot, go to 7-Eleven. In other words, go to the places where, go to warehouses where they work, go to meat packing plants and arrested this woman in Pennsylvania who was working there for many years, uh, a Latina who was working there making, obviously, they pay them way under arrest workers. Now, this is interesting. The U.S. government, notice, this is not about Trump. This is the U.S. government under Biden as well. Although the Trump administration always accuses Biden of inviting, which is nonsense, of actually inviting. Yes, come in. You're illegal. We'll take you. We'll take you. Inviting, as though the Biden administration was had the floodgates open to illegal migrants, which obviously is not correct, by the way. It has nothing to do with the reality, as this has been pointed out in congressional testimony, both on the Senate side and the House side, by Democrat senators and congressmen. Now, let's look at why not address the issue of the employer the meat packing company hiring that woman who is an illegal into the United States? Why, when there are laws in the books, why is she the anarchist and not defying authority and not the employer? When there are laws in the books clearly stating this is a violation of the law. You can't do this if you're an employer. It's illegal. They have done nothing to the employers. Whether it's large farm operations, by the way, out in the West and Southwest, or whether it's a meat packing plant in Pennsylvania, they don't do anything to them. Okay? They go after the workers. Okay? And there are reports that they have been collecting money, fines from the workers themselves. This one woman, I believe the report was in fact about this one woman at the meat packing plant. They sent her a bill to pay, because she was here for so many years, 1.7 million to the US government because she was here illegally all this time. They have been telling them that you owe us money simply because you're here illegally. They have not done the exact same thing for the employer. This is why some politicians, obviously on the Democratic side, especially progressive politicians, and especially of Hispanic background, but also others, non-Hispanics, have argued that this is not an issue of anarchism. This is an issue of an anti-labor policy. This is an issue of attacking the working class while giving a free pass to the employer, violating the law. If the state is supposed to be holding all actors, whether the business community or the worker, accountable, why go after the worker, as well as, by the way, trade unions that allow migrants, illegals, to join the trade union and achieve a modicum of legitimacy and protection within the trade union movement? They go after them, go after the trade union. So this is clearly a deliberate policy against the working class at a time that we have on record a couple of things. Number one, the adamant refusal of the GOP to raise the minimum wage. By the way, illegals, undocumented workers, in other words, undocumented workers make, like I said, in the case especially of a special cohort, the women in California, 44 cents on the dollar. Okay, so this is 66% down from what their counterparts make. But this is also an issue that goes to the heart of a bill that the House passed and the president is pushing, which is 4.5 trillion in givebacks, most of it to billionaires and corporations, most of it to the 5%, the richest Americans, the 5% of the richest Americans. So they're going after them to vilify the working class as though, and to distract and to justify the passage of a bill that guts Medicaid. They don't want, by the way, any undocumented workers covered by any of the social safety net programs. They argue this is a violation of the law. They're here illegally. This is not Europe, where they do cover them, by the way. So they don't want to provide any social safety net measures. And the ultimate goal is to argue they're the problem Not that we're transferring wealth from the middle class and the working class across America to give it to the richest 5%. So the way I see the attack on the migrants is twofold. One is political, and there is no doubt that California is one of those states. It's the largest state. It's one of a very wealthy state. Has been on the radar of the Trump administration going back, by the way, to his first term in office, 2017 to 2021. He had California on the radar back then. Back in, I believe, in August 2020, if I recall, he even designated what he called anarchist jurisdictions. And anarchist to the Trump administration back then, I don't know who within the administration, who was the genius that came up with the term anarchist jurisdiction, but to them, anarchist jurisdiction meant, okay, anyone defying unitary executive theory. Let me just briefly explain that. The Trump administration has been intent on pursuing unitary executive theory, which, by the way, is questionable as far as constitutional basis. Unitary executive theory simply means amassing powers at the executive level, defying the judiciary, defying the legislative branch. Those of you who watch Senate and House hearings know that Democratic senators and House members have questioned the Trump administration cabinet secretaries about the Trump administration defying the courts, defying the law, even the Supreme Court, ignoring court orders. And you have probably seen that the defense is no one can question the president, nor should they question the president. If they dare to, then we have to do something about that. So this idea of amassing massive power at the executive level, not at the legislative, which is what the founding fathers intended. The founding fathers followed the model of John Locke, the founder of liberal philosophy, which means that they wanted a strong legislative branch, which is elected by the people, and they wanted that to be balanced by the judiciary, which has oversight, and of course, an executive which manages the business of government on a day-to-day basis. A delicate balance of power. All of this is violated by the unitary executive theory. And here in August 2020 and today in June 2025, they are arguing that the problem is anarchism. So anyone defying unitary executive theory is an anarchist. An anarchist is someone saying, wait a minute, you are not explaining the legitimacy of your power outside the perimeters of what the Constitution and the law states. So this is a very serious issue. I want to point out that the anarchist goals, those who are truly anarchists, from Emma Goldman, a Jewish American immigrant, a feminist, and a pro-labor union advocate in the early 20th century, who was eventually punished by the US government and exiled to Canada, of all places. But then after her death, she had left a will wanting to be buried along next to trade unionists in Chicago. And from Emma Goldman, the eminent feminist and trade union activist, to Noam Chomsky in the late 20th, early 21st century, well-known anarchist. The goal is social justice, to create a better society, a society rooted in egalitarian liberal democracy, not liberal democracy, egalitarian democracy, a democracy where the government is accountable to the people, and a government that is mindful of the interests of all people, not a government catering specifically to the narrow interests of a small percentage within society. That is the goal of uh, the anarchists. The anarchists were also have been historically against authoritarianism, against um, regimes that use repression, that use force, and the the wing of anarchists historically from the 19th century to the present that opt for tactics that go beyond peaceful means. The ultimate anarchist using peaceful means was Mahatma Gandhi, by the way. He defied authority through peaceful means. What authority? Imperial England that had imposed colonization on the Indian subcontinent and was exploiting its labor and natural resources for decades, and doing so by force. Mahatma Gandhi was the ultimate peaceful anarchist. He defied colonial authority. His goal was social justice. His goal was to remove the repression, the legitimate authority, and this is what when uh, he was brought before the British authorities, the military authorities in the military court, he stated again and again that they have no legitimacy in India. This is not their country. Indians did not go to England to exploit British labor and resources. The British went to India to exploit um, Indian labor and resources. Mahatma Gandhi wanted them out. The ultimate social justice advocate, advocate of peace, and using peaceful means even against the background of the British using brutal force against the population of India. Now, in the 21st century, there has been a resurgence of anarchism, by the way. That's a fact. There are no statistics, whether FBI or like I said, the Pew Research Center, or any public opinion poll that has any kind of a fixed number of anarchists in the United States. Now, the United States, yes, it has had a history of anarchism. That was in the Emma Goldman era, from the late 19th century to the World War One, and actually in the 1920s there was the famous Sacco and Vanzetti case. These people who were executed wrongly, of course, and the government later recognized that yeah, they were wrongly executed. Anyway, that was the zenith of American anarchism, and they were intertwined with the feminist movement, the movement for universal democratic rights, the movement for to have trade union rights, and so this was a grassroots movement in the late 19th, early 20th century, and both Democrats and Republicans went after them, by the way. Um, Now, today, under the neoliberal system, from Reagan to the present, there has been a class war. And the class war strategy of the neoliberal political class, which transcends Democrats and Republicans, both mainstream Democrats, establishment Democrats, Wall Street, Cold War liberal Democrats, as well as the GOP are neoliberals. They just have a different strategy. The establishment Democrats are diversity, identity politics, neoliberals. The Republicans are authoritarian neoliberals under Trump. They have been since 2017 when he took office and institutionalized this. What we have is whether it is universities like Harvard and Columbia or University of Pennsylvania, any university asserting that it's defending academic freedom and the First Amendment to the Constitution, the free speech issue, or whether it is American citizens in defense of due process for mass deportations, against mass deportations, and people deported even wrongly in certain cases without due process, or imprisoned or detained, or in extreme cases like Alex Padilla, the U.S. Senator from California, by the way, handled with violence. Okay. The issue here is who is exercising the force. And this is a focus of the anarchists, and it has been since the late 19th century, that the entities that have the means to repression are the state and the established institutions. And repression doesn't have to be just police and military. It can also be economic repression. Today we have major institutions in globalization as a result of neoliberalism, like the IMF and the World Bank, whose policies bring out austerity policies, reducing living standards of the masses, of the laboring classes and the lower middle class. They reduce their living standards, so they bring out radicalization and socio-political polarization, exactly as we see in the United States. The United States could not be more polarized given the June 14th, 2025 protest throughout the United States on the day that the United States president held a military parade in honor of the armed forces, and of course coinciding with his birthday. Okay. A lot has been written about that and what that signifies for an open democratic society. Okay. So the means of repression, the means of exploitation, do not rest with some woman in a meat packing. She's an undocumented worker and she works in a meat packing plant. Okay, to support herself and her family. Fine. Now, she is not the focus of all evil. She's a worker. She's trying to survive. The issue here is the policies that the government adopts to deal with citizens both in the United States legally and illegally, and the constitutional boundaries that the government follows. And that's what the anarchists call into question. This is where the anarchists come and ask, what about the social justice component in our society? And they ask the same question when it comes to international peace. Why should there be support for forever war doctrine? Support for wars in Ukraine, and right now, as we speak, by the way, in the Middle East, U.S. and Iran, Israel and Iran, behind which, of course, the U.S. has made no secret that it is supporting Israel against Iran. Why should there not be a diplomatic settlement, whether it's the issue of ending the genocide war in Gaza or bringing about a settlement bring about a settlement to the Israeli-Arab conflict simply because the Israelis have been pursuing Lebensraum, um, a policy of expanding their living space, the settler policy, in other words, as it's called in Israel, and doing so through military means, destabilizing the Middle East at a time that there is already considerable destabilization because of the US tariff wars, because the US is afraid that it's going to lose its global hegemony because of the rise of China economically, and it seems unstoppable, and it has seemed unstoppable in the last 20 years. Okay, so that those are the key questions that the anarchists are asking. And when they show up, there are anarchist groups. They're small, by the way. It's nowhere near anarchist in the broader definition, the way the far right wing uses it. It's anybody who defies me, the president of the United States. That's not an anarchist. That's just someone who is protesting policies because of because they don't see how their interests and the interests of the public are served. Uh, However, there are anarchist groups that are against the IMF and whatever the IMF or the G7, for example, is a G7 meeting scheduled this summer in Canada, I believe, which should be interesting. Um, that is the question here, and that is how how government responds to dissidents. The test of a true democracy is how it treats its dissidents, not how it treats those who are docile and loyal to the regime, but how it treats its dissidents. That's the true test of a democracy. Now, like I said, the United States advertised itself through this administration as ushering in a golden age 6 months ago. And when you look at America today, it's more polarized, and according to some journalists and some scholars, this is more or less pre-Civil War conditions. When there are political assassinations, when there is a senator, I may not agree with the senator's views and so forth, but she showed up to ask the Homeland Security Secretary certain questions. And to say, well, he looked like all the other Mexicans, so he was thrown to the ground. That's really, there is a great deal of racism and white supremacy, behind all of this. Besides anti-labor sentiment, there is also white supremacist social Darwin's thinking on the part of the elites, which are mostly, not all, mostly Anglo-Saxon, and tend to be in favor of military and military solutions to enforcing conformity, social conformity, rather than to permitting open dialogue in a democratic society. The future for the United States, I'm afraid, regardless of whether it's Donald Trump or someone else, is not very good when it comes to reverting back to a full-fledged open society. I can't imagine, even President Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower was a general war hero from World War II, ordering a military parade, by the way, to coincide with some personal celebration of his. And I'm afraid that Joe Biden may have actually, although he was not into the cult of personality, he was very harsh in using the issue of anti-Semitism, manipulating it to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and to argue that, yeah, these are people who are dissidents. He opened the door to these charges of anarchism against universities, against protesters, period. And Trump just followed with the floodgates open thereafter. So this is not an issue of just the GOP and this particular president. When we look at at the past 4 years, no matter what the GOP says about Biden opening the floodgates to migrants, that's nonsense. When we look at how Biden handled dissidents, we we see some difference, but not much. He went after them, whether it was people who objected to the war in Ukraine or those who objected to the what the Israelis were doing in Gaza to innocent civilians. Yes, Hamas did hit. Hamas was guilty of attacking innocent civilians in an Israeli camp. That's all true. However, that doesn't mean that there is collective punishment, which is a violation of international law, and it is a violation of human rights, according to the United Nations and the International Court of Justice and the ICC both ruled as such. Um, I want to thank you for joining me. I want to ask you to write comments, send questions, and join this educational channel. Thank you very much.